let's say in the last 5 years, you build a reputation on Instagram or on Twitter, and you have, I don't know, hundreds of thousands or millions of followers. That's valuable, right? You have a voice, but that can be taken away at any time. And so whatever you built on that one actually is gone. And before you know it, this is the irony. The larger your voice becomes, actually, the more dependent you become on the platform.
Hey guys, welcome back to the show today. I'm here with chairman and co-founder of Animoca Brands, Yat. How are you doing today?
Very good. Thank you for having me. It's great. End of the summer, so everyone's coming back hopefully a little bit more relaxed. Choppy markets, but coming out good. So yeah, feeling pretty good about stuff.
Yeah, likewise. And thank you so much for doing this with me. I really appreciate it. But I wonder, what was your journey in crypto? How everything started?
Well, I mean, I think my real journey in the whole crypto Web3 space happened with CryptoKitties. So we had a studio in Vancouver called Fuel Powered that happened to share an office with another company called Axiom Zen at the time. And the co-founder of Fuel Powered, which was our studio, actually helped build CryptoKitties. And eventually he became one of the co-founders of what became Dapper Labs at the end. And we became investors in that. And when we saw what CryptoKitties did to the space and what it meant for potentially gamers and people to own their digital assets, we were hooked. So in late 2017, pretty much in November, December, we completely sort of saw the future, at least from our vantage point. And then we started investing in the space because, Animoca Brands was not a sort of blockchain Web3 company to begin with. We were I guess you could call it today, traditional mobile gaming company, and having done games for many, many years before, reasonably successfully, we basically completely moved into the Web3 space as what we thought originally as the future of gaming, but now we really see it as a future of everything. So it's also expanded from our original vision. But that's how it started, right? Really with NFTs and, as I like to call it, digital culture.
Sometimes when I speak to someone who's not as much into crypto as we are, I try to explain them how important is data and digital ownership, because nowadays we are moving towards a digital society, right? So when you speak to someone who has maybe not invested as much time as we do into what we are doing on a daily basis, it's quite interesting to talk about digital ownership. I mean, where do you see NFTs and Web3 changing the game specifically?
So one of the most valuable things about digital ownership is, when you talk about data, so data feels sort of a little bit sort of ephemeral. It's like, what is that? I can't touch it. I don't know it. I don't understand it. And so therefore, if you say your data is valuable, yeah, I know my data is valuable, but actually it doesn't really seem to mean much because I can't seem to make money out of my data in the same way that Facebook or Apple or Google might be able to. So I don't really understand it. So that's kind of the high level challenge that people have. So the way we like to describe it to people, and this is also how we think of tokens, by the way, is that actually what you're owning is a network effect or a representation of that network effect. And what we also like to say is that actually everything in life that is valuable to us is a form of a network effect. Your friends, your family, your social relationships, in China we call it guangxi, and whatever it is, right? You have a kind of relationship that you have for which you can create value from, and not necessarily purely in monetary terms, right? Value isn't just monetary. I mean, love is valuable, right? That doesn't mean that you can necessarily translate it into a monetary form, but it is valuable to you as an individual. And what is the basis of that? It's social relations. And what is social relations? It's a kind of network effect. And when you think of brands, for instance, the biggest brands in the world, whether this is, an Hermes or maybe even something like Apple or Nike or, even a brand like Tesla, for instance, what actually gives them their premium is their brand value. But what is a brand value? It's actually a network effect as well. It's what people say about you. It's being relevant. It's about grabbing your attention. And what the Web2 companies like Facebook understood really, really well early on is that actually the most powerful thing is actually grabbing your attention. And if you maintain that, that's what they kind of call the attention economy. And think about what we do today, whether this was radio in the earlier days, then TV, film and media, or books in the earliest of days, right? These forms of attention actually are the things that change the world, right? If it wasn't for books, then we wouldn't have, the kind of, changes we've seen in the world, ranging from economic changes, religious changes, political changes. And then look at today again, the social relations, the network effects of the internet actually created all these changes, both good and bad, that we see in the world today. So when you own essentially something digital, you own actually a network effect. Even when you own a game item, what makes it valuable and important to you is its implied network effect. If you're the only person who ever played this game, it won't be that valuable. But if a million people played the game and they remember it and they have stories and maybe they even have a similar item, then you've created a community. And again, what is a community? Like in Web3, we always say community, community, community. Actually, that's a network effect, right? So the bigger the community, the stronger the network effect. But I'll say one more thing as well. Not all networks are equal, right? That's like saying that the GDP per capita in North Korea would be the same as Hong Kong, for instance, right? Or Switzerland. And of course, the answer is no, right? North Korea has a much, much poorer GDP per capita because as a network, its individual purchasing power and its individual capability per user is much lower than, say, Hong Kong, which is maybe 7 times less the population, or maybe even like a Switzerland or Singapore, which is like, I think, 10 times less the population of North Korea. And yet it has an economy and a GDP per capita that probably dwarfs that of a place like North Korea. And the same is true for networks in the digital world, right? I mean, you have networks that might have, 10 million users, but they would not be as valuable as some networks that might only have a couple 100,000 users. And you can see this expressed, for instance, in NFTs versus meme coins. There might be some meme coins that have, millions of users, but its total sort of market value relative to the NFT collections, which has maybe only thousands or tens of thousands of users, might actually be more valuable overall because, again, its purchasing power or its network effects or its influence is bigger, right? So again, it comes down to network effects. And so these days we like to say digital ownership is the equivalent of essentially having a way of owning your own network effects or partake in the network effect of others, right? If you look at, for instance, something like having Ethereum, you're not owning Ethereum because it can derive a lot of yield for you. Actually, ironically, in this market, you can get better natural yields like in T-bills or just literally putting your cash in the bank. But actually, you believe that Ethereum has more value because of the fact that it can grow its network effect, not that it can grow its yield potential in that sense, right? And actually, one of the ironies, of course, is that in some ways, if you can reduce the cost of gas, which effectively would mean in some ways it would essentially reduce the yield potential for Ethereum, actually, maybe the network would grow faster and therefore become more valuable, right? It's kind of like the same thing in a country. What's the right balance between too high taxes and too low a tax, right? For instance, right? We're going through all of these conversations in the physical world as well, in those areas of economic policy. So it's the same thing, but ultimately it's about growing networks. And so yeah, so that's how we describe digital ownership, and all the things that we are defined by is through the ownership of things, right? I mean, the clothes we wear is a social signaling of our social reputation, which is essentially another kind of network effect.
There is so much to unpack in here. As we say, Web 1 was read only, Web 2 was read and write, and Web 3 read, write, and own. And I think it's very much needed because, like you said so well, it's not necessarily about monetization. Like I could decide that my data is mine and mine alone, and I want to revoke it from a service or a portal or whatever it is I might use because I want to become the sole owner. And I don't know if you agree with me here, but what we've seen, I believe, so far in NFTs is just the tip of the iceberg. We've seen NFTs as of JPEGs, people making millions of dollars selling monkeys, as people say. But the majority of the people, they don't understand what has been accomplished yet because it's so much deeper than it feels like. Like the fact that I can say, this is mine and I own it, right? And it's basically been forever into a ledger, which is a decentralized network. It's a little bit tricky to digest. Sometimes I give the example of when I speak to people, they don't have the same level of depth that we do into Web3 and NFTs. I say, hey, if you go to a museum and take a photo of the Mona Lisa, you don't own the Mona Lisa. You're just taking a photo of the Mona Lisa. So if you right click and save the NFT, it's not yours. You have a copy of it, which is not the same thing, right?
Right. The fact that you can right click save or take a photo of the Mona Lisa, which is the equivalent as you described, actually makes the NFT more valuable. This is the other thing, because you're actually proliferating and expanding its network, but you actually don't own it. And with that, you don't actually own sort of the raw sense of its network effect. One of the things that people talk about art collecting, they say what actually makes the collection isn't the artist, it's the collector. The more influential and the more, let's call it, powerful the collector network is, that's actually where a lot of the value resides in, because they're the ones who create the narratives and the stories around it. And so long before, after time when maybe the artist himself is gone, the collectors are the ones who keep that legacy alive and they maintain it. But the reason they do it is because they actually own it and they have a stake in it. And so this is the other thing. When you own something, it doesn't matter if it's physical or digital. When you own something, actually you have a stake in it. You're real. And I think this is another part that a lot of people sometimes don't fully appreciate. Because in the real world, you have to stake something in order to get something, right? I mean, it doesn't have to be money, but in some ways, if this person has an office and he maybe has his own business and he has some number of employees and he has been here for 10 years, he's got a stake, right? He's got a stake in both the reputation and the network he is in. And therefore, I'm more willing to do business with him or more willing to do stuff with him because I believe that he has something to lose. He has invested in it. He has proven something, right? Whereas if you kind of go in and it's just, you're a stranger, I might give you the benefit of the doubt, but I'm going to be a lot more sort of cautious working with you because I don't know who you are. I don't know what you've achieved. I don't know your background. I don't know what you have at stake, right? And so ownership is one of the best ways of proving you have a stake in something, right? And money is kind of one level of that. But the level that we express ourselves mostly is cultural, right? So for instance, if you go to a certain university, right? I mean, sure, money helped you maybe go through the studies, but if you have a PhD or if you have a master's degree or if you study a certain field and you're the expert in that field, you have a reputation. You have something at stake, right? And that's the other thing. That reputation, by the way, is entirely virtual. It's not physical at all. You can't really hold it in the same way as you would maybe a car or a house. But it is perhaps the most valuable thing as individuals for us, our reputation and the stake we have in this. And therefore, we're not willing to give that up, right? Because there's so much to lose and it's so important to us. And so NFTs now represent that, I think, in a way that you can transport. And I would say, again, even within the Web3 NFT world, because it's on chain, we shouldn't just look at it as the fact that you own it. We can now also see what you did with it when you owned it. So, for instance, someone who owns a Mochaverse or Bored Ape, do we think the person who sells it and trades it every day versus the person who never sold it and does stuff with it and held it for all this time, which of the two do you think might deserve a higher reputation? And depending on the audience, you might say the person who sort of held it and has been loyal to it might deserve the better reputation. And actually, what happens over time, that reputation accrues, and you can only prove it through ownership. You can't prove it if it's not yours, right? And I think this is kind of what the platforms have done so well, because things like likes and follows on, let's say, Instagram or TikTok, those are actually a proxy for reputation. But the problem is that reputation doesn't belong to you. You can lose it anytime. They can just take it away from you, all the value you've generated from this. And I think, again, this is one of those things that we don't think about. I sometimes liken this in a sort of slightly more dramatic way. It's like taking away your sort of your last name or your name, right? Because your reputation is your persona, your identity. If you think about what happened, for instance, when X, basically when Elon acquired Twitter and renamed it X, he decided that he wanted to do something with music on X. The person who owned the @music handle that had hundreds of thousands of followers lost it, just lost it, and he wasn't even given any kind of due compensation for it. And he was shocking because he had it for so long, and suddenly he realized actually all the reputation that he built on that, all the sort of business opportunities basically moved on to someone else, right? And that's the thing, right? You want to be the owner of your things, and because, as you had rightly said in the beginning, we're spending so much more time digitally. Actually, our digital time and our digital reputation is probably going to be, if not already, more valuable to many of us, if not most of us. And therefore, why shouldn't we own it? So, and I think NFTs represent that very well.
This reminds me of like the TCP/IP, HTTP, FTP moment when in the 90s we kind of started to play with the internet, right? So we found a bunch of protocols. We didn't even know necessarily what would have happened 20 or 30 years later. We just started a few services and now we have Wi-Fi, for example, which was built on those premises that we didn't know much about. So I feel like NFTs and Web3 is coming aggressively in the same speed. Like sometimes when I think about gamers, for instance, I'm not a gamer myself, but I play some video games here and there. And when people say, oh, gamers do not need Web3, it's because they don't understand. Because honestly, imagine you play a video game, you have a car, so you drive a car. Well, first of all, you could have interoperability, so you could play the same car in multiple games. You could sell your progress by playing the game. You could rent it to someone else, so you create a different level in the game. So instead of becoming a driver, you're becoming someone who rent cars to other people and have a percentage on when they play. So you become like a different player. There's so many ways to skin it.
I think one of the other things that I think people don't understand as well is when people talk about interoperability in Web3, which is what you're describing as well, the fact that you can move things around. Actually, what you're really moving around isn't necessarily the object itself. That could be part of it. What you're actually moving around is your sort of social layer as an individual. So if I, for instance, am a really good gamer and I have spent a certain amount of money in the game, therefore I have a reputation. In Web3, that reputation is exportable because I own NFTs and assets. They become my symbols, essentially my symbolic forms of capital, where I can now say and see, oh, this guy spent this many years in this game and he may have this level and he may have this achievement and he's spent this kind of money, roughly, give or take, right? No different, by the way, when we look in the physical world and watch someone who might have a Rolex or an Hermes bag or someone who wears certain type of shoes, whether they're Nikes or whether they're Gucci's or whatever that may be, right? We basically have a way in which we can sort of evaluate certain things about the type of social status that they want to emanate from them to create some kind of, sort of network of whatever it is that they're trying to build. That now becomes possible in Web3. And so what happens, and what is already happening, but will happen even more, is that you can now start targeting these customers with specifically what they want, because the value that you pay to advertisers will go directly to them. So for instance, in gaming, we spend about $100 billion a year advertising games, mostly to promote users to come into the game, on Facebook, Google, Apple, all those guys. But actually, how much of the money that Facebook, Google, and Apple receives goes back into either making games or actually goes into the hands of the gamers who actually would play the game? And the answer is next to nothing, right? But in Web3, through airdrops, for example, we can basically give an incentive for people to try the game. And instead of paying Apple or Google, you can pay directly to the end user, because now I authentically know, yes, you are this gamer, whether you played Valorant or whether you played Sandbox or whether you played Axie Infinity or whether you played League of Legends, it doesn't matter. I now know if you have an NFT and you have a certain history with it, that I can actually sort of track you. And so what that now means is that, I can give you a benefit, which you can choose to cash out if you want, or if you want to spend some money inside the game itself. And we found that every time you do this, more value is being actually paid inside the game than outside of it, because the percentage of people coming back into the economy is much higher, and is actually a better benefit to the end user. So I do think the advertising industry, for instance, is going to get completely disrupted as a result. For people who are not initiated in the Web3 world, the example I sometimes give is, how much money would you spend as, let's say, a luxury brand if you could genuinely target every single Rolex owner who owns a Rolex, not person who follows the Rolex page, which is like tens of millions probably, but actually the ones who bought one and currently own one? That would be worth a lot to you. And you would probably spend, much more proportional money per user to them, which gives much more value to the true ownership of them, of owning these items, rather than necessarily, blasting it to a website where, to Facebook group or like an Instagram channel where you have, millions of followers who don't own them, right? Who are just maybe aspiring towards them. And that's a certain kind of audience, but again, you can't target sort of the genuine audience. And that's actually what's now possible. It also creates more of a fairer marketplace, because now if a customer is broadly available to all, then really it's the best product and the best service and or the best benefit that ends up winning the game, which I think again is really what the hallmark of capitalism was supposed to be: a free and fair market.
I completely agree. It reminds me again to go back and touch on the internet. I was kind of pitching to companies back in the days in Italy. I said, hey, you can have a website, you can have things. And they were like, no, I have it. I go on TV, I go on the radio. I don't care about the website. I was like, yeah, but no, but the difference is if you buy advertisement on a newspaper, for example, you don't know how many people have seen it. You only know how many people have bought the newspaper, but you don't know whoever has seen page 29, which is where your ads was, and you don't know who from there took an action. You can just make some number out of nowhere, but you don't have any specific data. Whether with the web, I can pinpoint you to exactly whoever clicked that link. Now, it was early,
Yes.
people did not understand, and this over time created a new kind of segment, like you said so well. I think Web3 is going to do the same thing. It's going to create a different channel for companies to brand and market specific owners. I'll be able to have even some sort of like a phygital, as we say, like digital and physical merge together in some sort of a tango where I have an asset, but I have dual ownership. One is in cyberspace and one is, well, what is real anyway, but one I can touch it. It's tangible, right?
Yeah.
So the number of maneuver I can do are infinite. And to say something a little bit controversial, I don't know if you agree here with me, but kind of reminds me of the day where you could go into a toy store, like a real toy, a physical toy store, purchase a chessboard, right? You could then go back home with that chessboard, which is truly yours because you own it physically. You can do whatever you want. You can burn it, you can break it, you can use it to level your library, you can paint the chess pieces. It becomes truly yours. Whether now moving into digital, you don't actually own anything. Because when I go on Apple TV and I buy movies, they're not mine. Like I only have access to an account, which
Yes.
Apple allow me to use it, but they can decide anytime to stop me to access my
To remove
folder,
it.
right? So we very much
That's
need,
right.
if you ask me, a technology who says, hey, I don't care, I don't need any third party. You connect with this address to that folder and whatever is inside belongs to you. You can rent it, resell it, watch it, destroy it, delete it. It's entirely up to the user. So we moved so fast into this digital space that we very much need companies like yours coming in and providing services to enhance the digital experience, if it makes sense.
Yes, and I think it's more rather than saying enhance the digital experience because it does enhance it, but it enhances it at a meta level. So, for instance, the gameplay itself, let's say of chess that you mentioned, and in fact, we have our own version of that called AnyChess coming out very soon. Just interesting that you would mention that. But either way, is not the fact that the game of chess would radically change as a result of that. But it's the fact that the social relations, the connection points of what you're building in chess belong now to you. So, in other words, the networks you build, the reputation you have is yours and cannot be taken away. And I think this is really important because when you build a reputation, whether it's physical or digital, that is actually value you invest and accrue in yourself. Never mind investing in something that has value and might generate value over time, whether this is physical or digital. But actually, you're investing in yourself, your own relations, and in your own reputation. And that's no different than, let's say in the last 5 years, you built a reputation on Instagram or on Twitter, and you have, I don't know, hundreds of thousands or millions of followers. That's valuable, right? You have a voice, but that can be taken away at any time. And so whatever you built on that one actually is gone. And before you know it, this is the irony. The larger your voice becomes, actually, the more dependent you become on the platform. Because suddenly it's too, risky or inexpensive to lose the platform in which you have, your fame, shall we say, or your relations or your network. And by the way, this is the same how people think about, when they leave a country, when they immigrate somewhere else. One of the deepest considerations isn't just the economic one, which is obviously maybe a reason they might leave. It's the fact what they're leaving behind. Is it their family? Is it their friends? Is it their relationships? Is it their reputation? These are actually often the more difficult decisions that they are making as people, because that's actually what's so valuable. Right. And so in some form, you could say, I would argue that the Web2 social media platforms have created perhaps one of the most sort of human-centered ways of capturing not just our attention, but actually a need where effectively I feel very much that we've been enslaved by the platforms. But in Web3, you become the platform itself. because you can move your identity through the ownership of your things and therefore all your reputation wherever you want, right? So, for instance, you can measure your reputation a little bit today based on what's in your wallet, right? And of course, with things like what we do with Mocha ID, we're trying to extend that further. But the point is that this is now your identity. It's sovereignly yours. It can't be taken away from you. And so you can move it anywhere you want. And companies will come to you because they know that you're, someone that is valuable in whatever areas that you've created value for, and create opportunity from that, right? That to me is basically where this is all headed. When you think of digital, it's the way to scale, right? So in the past, we've really been limited from a human relation standpoint to really only connect physically to the people we can talk to. But the digital version of that actually has been sort of usurped by the platforms. And now we can take control of that and therefore generate more value, because actually, if you own it, then actually it's your capital asset, right? Reputation is a capital asset that just belongs to you. And then over time, as you invest it, it gets more valuable, more valuable. And we see this in the physical world, right? If your reputation is more valuable, then you might get higher paying jobs or better opportunities, more investment options, more friends, more whatever, right? All of these things start to accrue on you because of the fact that you actually sort of get a dividend of what you own, which in this case is your reputation. And in the digital world, that would be essentially necessary, but only possible in Web3. You don't own your digital reputation in Web2.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I mean, without a doubt, Animoca Brands, you guys have been innovating and killing in the space, bringing so much innovation. I mean, what challenges companies like yours are facing at the moment to build into this kind of unknown space?
Well, I mean, I think the biggest challenge really remains, how do we get more users into the space? So one of the reasons that we were very early investors in Ton, and we really sort of helped push that narrative, and basically started to sort of we're the largest validator, for instance, as well, is because we hope that something like Ton will help bring mass adoption into Web3 more and more. And we do believe that hundreds of millions of users are going to be joining Web3 because of Ton over the next 12 to 18 months. So that's something that we're very, very hopeful for, and we can kind of see a little bit of that happening as well. But really, the largest challenge is the fact that, to your earlier point, this idea of digital ownership, while people will not disagree that ownership is important, it's still a difficult topic for people to understand, because a lot of people don't even understand physical ownership, as in, they think they own their house because they live in the house, many people.
Yeah.
But actually, they own the house because there's a piece of paper that's, in this case, certified by a central organization, i.e. your government, that says you own this house. And that government only exists really because the social fabric and the community allows it to, right? And in the countries where you do not have a cohesive government because the social fabric doesn't allow it, then essentially where you live actually doesn't have much meaning, even if a piece of paper says you do, right? So you could argue it's even less stable. And we see this in countries where, maybe the currency is unstable as well, and all these things where, you have economic uncertainty because you can't have ownership. And that's the other thing. Any country that has low uncertainty on your ownership, or maybe the inability to have ownership, are the poorest in the world and have very low GDPs. And in those countries where you have high sort of protection of your property rights, and therefore the appreciation and potential of sort of capital value on the things you invest in and own, that's actually the countries that actually have the highest GDPs, and most interesting also, the highest forms of liberty. So the more ownership you have amongst the sort of individuals in question in your particular society or community you have, actually the more economic opportunities you have, the more entrepreneurial activities, the more capitalist opportunities, and of course, the more freedom. But this is something that is not often understood, and ironically is less understood in the West than in the East. Right? So, for instance, in America, you might still find a lot of people in gaming, for instance, who don't like NFTs. They won't object to ownership, but they don't like it. What they worry is the financification. They worry about the fact that it's about money. But actually, in reality, the gaming company is making billions of dollars off you anyway. You just don't know it, right? So that hasn't been made transparent to you, right? So therefore, there's this ignorance. So many people don't understand money. They don't understand value. They don't understand capitalism. And so consequently, they also become negative towards it. You see this as well, not just in developing America, but also in Europe for quite some time already, where there's a lot of people who don't like money, right? Not in the sense that like it in the sense that, oh, they need it for day to day, they get it. But this idea of accumulating capital and investing and growing it is something that is not natural to them. But in large part because they've not been educated. And also because they've not been able to participate in it as well because they don't understand it. And so the challenge in the growth of Web3, I think, to me, is connected to the understanding of value, property rights, and capitalism. It's therefore, not unsurprising to me that people who are very capitalist minded and who appreciate essentially entrepreneurialism and business and essentially capitalist values are generally more drawn towards Web3 than those who don't. And so, for those same reasons, you have people who are not sort of pro crypto, shall we say, are actually also the kind of people who generally are not pro sort of, let's call it, sort of, capitalism as well. There is actually a correlation between that as well, which I think is interesting. In Asia, though, we've gone through a cycle where, in living memory, over the last 30 to 40 years, we benefited greatly from capitalism, right? As in, property rights. I mean, if you look at, for instance, places like South Korea, Southeast Asia, China, right? I mean, these are actually countries that have become very capitalist in their framework, have a great respect for property rights, and now have become some of the biggest economies in the world. But they did it by embracing this. And therefore, these markets are also the ones who are actually most welcoming to Web3. I mean, last year, when most of the West was retreating from Web3, actually it was Asia and the Middle East that actually really sort of doubled down on it and basically embraced it in a big way. And precisely, I think, because of the fact that here in Asia, people are much more welcoming to capitalism and the opportunities around it than they are in the West. So I think that remains a challenge. But what we do believe is that as we bring Web3 to the rest of the world, and it's growing, of course, we actually will also make them more financially included and therefore more financially literate. So there's a correlation to me between the growth of Web3 and the growth of financial literacy, which I think is wonderful. Because I think if most of the world becomes more financially literate, actually we will have a safer world. It'll be harder to do these kind of economic scams that we see, right? People will be smarter in their investing. They will be better at managing their money. I mean, that's what we want people to do. And I think there's a correlation between the growth of that and the growth of Web3.
Such a beautiful topic. It's like, I feel like it's a big illusion. It's interesting you mentioned real estate. I always say you don't actually own your house. If you have to pay someone else to own it, it's not yours. If the ledger is not in your hands, it's not yours. It's a beautiful illusion. And this is what made me go full into specifically Bitcoin, but Bitcoin and crypto in my world are separate things, both beautiful, both needed. But when it comes to store my wealth and value and sweat equity, I mean, the guy with the Satoshi hats, of course, gives away, but Bitcoin is my weapon. But I also like to, of course, invest and speculate into other stuff like NFTs and Web3, which is so much needed. But for me, the ownership thing was crucial because when you open that door and you go into the rabbit hole saying, what does I really own? Like if I want to invest some capital and I buy some gold and the gold is into a vault and there is a company in between me and the vault, is the gold really mine? Well, no, it's theirs, right? So data, same as you said in the beginning, my passport, my ID, the game I play, the asset I have, what is really mine and how do I define what is yours and what is mine and how can I live in a society where digital and physical are mixing it together into some sort of a weird situation where I possibly could own the same object in two different time space, So it becomes really interesting. What's your take on Bitcoin? I mean, do you like it? Do you have some?
I mean, I guess it's almost impossible for anyone in the space not to have Bitcoin. And as you say, I think Bitcoin can be viewed slightly differently from the rest of crypto, although very much intertwined, because I think of Bitcoin a little bit like digital gold. And I see ourselves a little bit as the kind of, gold age of sort of, digital assets for the time being, right? In the same way that, currencies used to be gold backed, not that long ago, actually, right? If you think about it, right? And now, of course, it's completely changed. So I see that happening sort of in some similar parallels. because I think what's happening with with ordinals, for instance, in BRC20 is very interesting as well. Because to me, that was the introduction of basically a more sort of specific form of digital culture inside Bitcoin, which has created both controversy and value into the ecosystem and the narratives around it. First, I would argue that culture is the most important thing in any economy that it relates to humans, right? And at the end of the day, unless the world is run by simply AI bots and we don't need people anymore, culture is by definition the most valuable thing that we need to have, right? When you think about it in sort of Web3 terms, I would describe culture as the deepest TVL of any economy. When you think about everything you purchase, even over the last week, whether it's your clothes, your shoes, or maybe even the food that you buy, right? Actually, they are cultural in nature, right? It's not just Netflix and entertainment and Amazon Prime, or Gucci bags that are culture, or going to a museum. It's how we live, right? If I go to a nice restaurant and I make a certain kind of pasta, actually I'm having Italian culture, for instance, right? And I'm embracing that, right? If I really am only eating food for sustenance, then I probably just need a shake. And I probably just need something that's fairly tasteless, that has all the right nutrients and vitamins. And, from a pure biological sense, I'm okay. But actually, from a cultural standpoint, from enjoyment with friends and family, from social relationships, for instance, actually, I'm very poor, right? And that's actually what we seek, right? So if you count those things as cultural attention and cultural investment, actually, I think we spend probably almost everything in a form of culture. And those countries that don't invest in culture and don't have cultural spending, shall we say, are actually poor economies. Because again, to me, culture is tied also to national pride and patriotism. If you're proud of your country, you have a strong culture. If you're not proud of your country, actually you don't have a culture. And if you don't have a culture, you don't invest in your nation or your environment, or in this case, your digital environment as well. If you see, for instance, the culture that we see even with meme coins or with Bitcoin or with Solana or Ethereum, for instance, you see a certain culture develop that goes beyond simply, how much is it worth? But actually, there's a sense of pride, there's a sense of ideology, there's a sense of belief and faith that all builds into this in this sort of soup that we call culture. So to me, the introduction of essentially ordinals was an interesting first wave into sort of bringing this type of culture that really sort of developed, with ERC 721, Ethereum, with NFTs in that entire ecosystem. Now with Bitcoin, and similarly, 5-6 years ago, a lot of the Ethereum guys were like, NFTs, what is that? This fixed supply, and it's unique, but actually everyone can just sort of basically copy paste, right? I mean, all that type of stuff came. Exactly those same arguments came out, and now nobody says that anymore because they understand, at least most of them, how important culture is. We're going through exactly the same conversations currently with Bitcoin, where some people are actually arguing that things like ordinals are actually a bug, right? and they're trying to sort of prevent it, all that kind of stuff, right? So first, I would say, on that, I think it's because of these things that culture is introduced into Bitcoin that becomes more sustainable, because miners are going to start making fees, and have already started making significant fees from those activities, rather than just simply hoping that the price of Bitcoin will keep going up, right? So that's obviously an area, another demonstration to me how important culture is in every sort of growing and established ecosystem. But I would also say that Bitcoin, while it will always be here and is probably, will continue to be the most valuable digital asset, which underpins much of the Web3 economy, it is also something that is becoming more unattainable. This whole struggle with Bitcoin is that if you have Bitcoin from before, great for you, and that's wonderful. But it's getting harder and harder for new people to come into the space. And my general view is that and this I think is an issue that a lot of Bitcoin people have, is that actually launching of new tokens is a form of inflation to the broader ecosystem. But actually, what it does, it makes it more inclusive to these new communities, because that's how you build new networks from the ground up, right? And to me, this is sort of a key point, which is that while Bitcoin is important, we can't expect, just like we can't expect countries to function the same way, that every, let's call it a Web3 economy, can be a satellite nation of Bitcoin. But that's what many of the Bitcoin maxis would like to see, right? And of course, who benefits are the people who own Bitcoin in the beginning. And every person who adopts Bitcoin thereafter is actually one that essentially becomes, in some ways, subservient to the ones who've had it before. So to me, the conversations that I see in Bitcoin today, amongst certain group, not all of them, of course, and the way that they are against new token launches and against all these things and trying to stop it, and even sometimes against ordinals, because people in ordinals may not have come from Bitcoin before, but they've made money in Bitcoin in those ecosystems. To me, it sounds very similar to your classic class struggle, right? Which is
Yeah.
basically, people who have established a certain kind of influence and power, which is represented to their ownership in a certain way of doing things, are now being challenged. And this challenge becomes threatening. And whether they understand it or not, it's the classic form of class warfare that we have seen for centuries and centuries and centuries, right? And it was not so long ago that even people in traditional finance were against, what's happening in the tech industry, against all those, VCs that came in and disrupted the space, and all the sort of Google engineers and Yahoo guys in the early days making all this money and kind of, us sort of changing the landscape. And with that, by the way, they brought in different forms of culture that mattered. So suddenly suit and tie wasn't fashionable anymore. You started coming in, I don't know, sort of, outdoor wear and, Patagonia outfits, that kind of stuff, right? And then you no longer, riding Rolls Royces and Bentleys and Mercedes. Now you're going with Tesla or electric cars, or, you're having your, I don't know, like Icelandic water as opposed to, your sort of, your red wine. I mean, so the point is, with each of these shifts of sort of new wealth that comes into the space that's challenging, let's call it the old wealth class, comes new cultural norms, comes new opportunities. And to me, this is what we're seeing right now. So there is a struggle of the traditional wealth category, including tech, that is kind of resisting or a little skeptical of crypto, versus the new wealth that is actually coming from that area. And it's not the same. They're not necessarily interrelated, right? So the people in crypto actually are a new wealth category that didn't exist before. It's kind of like Chinese people, 20 years ago, they're a new wealth category, or Japanese people 40 years ago, they were a new wealth category, right? Like people who were merged into the industry with sources of capital that then ended up shaking up the space a little bit. I mean, America was that category, 30, 40, 50 years ago as well. This new wealth capital that was traveling the world. And a lot of people were like, oh, there are these Americans with all their money. Back in the day, people, especially in Europe, I remember growing up there, they would look down on them. And of course now it's normal, but it's that. And even in the microcosm of crypto, you can see the difference between California and Florida, right? If you look at Miami, new wealth, a lot of it in crypto, fastest growing economy in the US, really disrupting and shaking things up, and people looking at that. And it's interesting how the commentary around what's happening in Miami isn't all positive despite its growth. And again, I think it has a lot to do with this sort of, inherent sort of class sort of struggle and class warfare that is happening even in the micro level. So anyway, I think of Bitcoin going through this phase at this moment in time. I think it can only, I think if they need to open up a bit more, I think into the broader Web3 ecosystem and be more participatory in crypto, if they really want to see sort of mass adoption and inclusion. I think it's unrealistic to expect that you will have, billions of people join the world, and it can only happen on top of Bitcoin. But Bitcoin is very important. I see it as a digital gold, and I see it as an underpinning of the Web3 economy broadly.
I like to think about that, Bitcoin is one piece of the puzzle or the chessboard. It could be one piece, it could be maybe the queen or the king, whatever, but there is many others needed. And who am I to forbid people to use ordinals? I mean, I'm for the free market. Let it out. If people want to use it, let it have
Yes.
it. That's the best way to tackle it, I
I mean,
think.
it's funny. I think it's exactly. I think it's ironic that the people who talk about that, who also claim to be sort of free market liberalists, are then choosing to restrict people on
Yeah.
what is free, right? It's like sort of which side of free are you on, right?
Who am I to dictate what Bitcoin is going to be used for? It's decentralized. There is no CEO. We are all Satoshi. We have miners. We have all sorts of different people contributing in different ways. Let people do whatever they want. If there is a market for ordinals, let them mint it. If people don't want to mint it, well, it's going to
Yes.
die anyway. So that's how I see it. But
Right.
there is one thing I wanted to ask you. What is the most important quality you think nowadays an entrepreneur must have?
There are many qualities that I think entrepreneurs need to have. but I would like to sort of maybe specify it specifically to the kind of entrepreneur that would stand out amongst other entrepreneurs, ideally. And by the way, I don't think people find that necessarily on day one, right? Because it's a journey. Like, I'm as an entrepreneur, I'm very different today than I was, say, maybe 30 years ago or more when I sort of started my entrepreneurial journey. If I had to distill it down, I would say I would say, successful entrepreneurs are the ones who really desire to live life with impact and purpose. And I say this not just as a sort of cliche thing, but rather to say that if an entrepreneur is building to something that they believe is greater than themselves, then essentially they're willing to sacrifice, push forward, change the world, right? That, by the way, isn't true for everyone, or maybe isn't true for everyone in the beginning, but may evolve so over time, right? So, in other words, we can't. I mean, if you look at some of the sort of most successful entrepreneurs that we actually speak of in many ways, whether this is like the Steve Jobses or the Elon Musks of, which of course there's not that many of them, turned out that it wasn't their first or second venture that made them the biggest that they are or changed the world. It was really what they did later. The experiences before were simply the proof that they had something. But the number of people who achieved what, let's say, Steve Jobs and Elon Musk achieved in the early days and then made a lot of money and moved on to do something else, and the ones who then actually sort of emerged from those experiences and became even bigger, right? And sort of made massive impact in the world, basically shaping the world as we see it today. Those are, the ones that really believe in a form of impact and purpose. I mean, you have many stories of this. I think people like Sam Altman are kind of in a similar category, for instance, right? Where again, maybe, it took time for them to find the thing that they really believe so strongly in, that everything essentially is poured into that attention, and it's not about money, right? And so I often see the entrepreneur, which I have appreciation for. The entrepreneur journey does need people to get a certain type of freedom in order for you to sort of achieve that. And we don't necessarily use this, but if you look at the classic sort of Maslow's hierarchy, right? If you were to apply that in a kind of entrepreneurial journey, you do need entrepreneurs, which is, I think, majority of entrepreneurs. They want to build something meaningful, but obviously they want to attain some form of financial freedom attached to that, and it's a business option. And if they get to a certain level where now they've achieved a certain type of financial freedom, that's where they can begin their journey of self-actualization, which to me is essentially living this life of impact and purpose in whatever it is that you're trying to do, which may or may not be entrepreneurial. So I would say, the entrepreneurs that have this quality are the ones who actually can sort of last the journey, because it is truly a marathon of our life. It is not a sprint.
I love it so much. I know you are in Hong Kong and you guys speak more Cantonese, but I can say 谢谢你是我的好朋友.
Thank you very much.
I remember little pieces while living in Shanghai. I picked up some here and there. But yeah, thank you so much. Honestly, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show. I really appreciate you being here today with us.
Thank you for your time, and it was great being here.
Likewise, I will see you in Singapore, okay?
See you in Singapore.
And guys, thank you so much for watching. We'll see you on the next one.
Bye.